So I've always wanted to try to weave with willow bark, and I had some which I'd cut and dried, so I decided I would re-soak it for about an hour in water and see what I could come up with. So the first thing I did was cut several strips about 2 foot long, and then I divided these strips into even strips of about 1.5 inches or about 40 mil. And I decided I was going to need 8 of these to create a 4x4 square. And luckily I was able to get 2 strips out of each. And it was important, especially when I was learning, to cut these strips of equal width. And so once we have our strips cut, we lay 4 up and down, we weave the 5th under, over, under, over, the next under, over, the opposite of the first, until we have all 4 strips going across and forming a 4x4 grid, which is then tightened up so that there are very few spaces. Now we have to bear in mind that bark is brittle, so we do this to its limitations. And once we have the 4x4 square, which is in the middle of the bark strips, I then take a needle and thread and I sew it together just to keep the shape. And again the thread goes under, over, under, over. And we do this in turn around all 4 legs, pulling the thread in tight to the square base and finishing off by tying the end to the beginning thread, and this shall hold it in position. And because I want the bark on the outside, I'm going to flip the space over so that we're working with the bark inside. Once we've flipped it, we now come to the intriguing bit where the original square corners are now going to be on the side of the basket, and the new corners are going to be in the middle of the original square sides. So in order to encourage the basket to bend across the new side, I'm using this Stanley knife just to encourage the bark into its new position. And now the weaving begins with the middle 2 strips of any side, where we weave them across each other to form the new corner. Now eventually these will be perpendicular to each other. We peg with one of the 4 pegs that we need. And first of all, we do the middle 2 strips of all 4 sides and peg them together. And after we've done that, we come back and we take the outer strips of the 4 sides and we weave them in order, just maintaining our weaving pattern under and over, under and over. Now these 4 strips should be running perpendicular to each other, and in encouraging the basket into the shape, our corners become defined. Again, we just work from side to side until all strips are woven and our corners are formed, and I'm just encouraging the bark to bend on the sides of the new base. And so it's just a matter of gently but firmly weaving our basket higher and higher using the classic weaving pattern, under, over, under, over. And it's such a gentle thing that you can't squeeze it too hard, but you're trying to encourage the gaps to close while maintaining our square base. And so we work around gently until we get, quite often it's the length of the bark which determines the height of these baskets. And so we work until we've reached the shortest strip of bark. And that determines the height. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get another strip of the bark that's left over as a wraparound strip at the top. Now the good thing about the bark is that it rips down its length. And so I've decided to use a bit of the bark which has holes from the original branches of the tree, and as long as it's long enough to wrap around itself with a little bit of an overlap, then I'm going to begin by sewing the bottom end of the bark all the way through the top of the basket. Now the bark could be tough, so we may need a thimble for this, and then we wrap the rest of the wraparound bark over itself, and again we sew through both thicknesses of bark plus the bark of the basket. And so I've decided that I'm going to do 2 rows of sewing, and once it's secured by a couple of stitches, I'm going to cut off the excess from the top with a pair of secateurs, and in doing so it allows easy access to the inside of the basket, and therefore sewing is much easier. So we'll continue our sewing in 2 strips around the basket, and when we get back to where we started, again we can tie our ends together. Trim off any excess at the last footer, and there we have a little bark basket. If you want to find out more, just check out biggreenweaving.com.